All right, we're good.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica Sims. I'm with DMA. I'm excited to have you all here for this annual training on serving survivors of domestic violence. So this training, some of you may have attended in past years. HUD requires that CoCs provide annual training for coordinated entry staff and CoC programs around this topic. And each year we try to tailor it to specific questions or needs that we have arising in the CoC. So really looking forward to this presentation. And we're going to have Maria Williams on, who many of you know and have the pleasure of working with, who works at the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence as the Housing Program Manager and works with a lot of you across the Eastern and Western PA CoCs. A few quick housekeeping items. If you have questions, you can feel free to type them at any time in the chat. I've already struggled with the all panelists versus all panelists and attendees, but if you want to ask a question, I would recommend that you ask it to all panelists and attendees. That way everyone can see your question and everyone can see the response as well. In terms of Q&A, you can ask questions as we go. You'll notice that everyone's muted since we have such a large group here today. But if you have questions, please utilize the chat function and we will look forward to going over your questions either throughout the presentation or at the end. We will also reach out to all registered attendees after the presentation to share any materials. And at the end of the presentation, we'll also post links so that you can log your attendance. If you're a CoC program staff or coordinate entry staff, you'll want to make sure that you log your attendance for today's training. I think that's all of the logistics we need to go over this morning. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Maria Williams.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Jessica. And it's lovely to be here with you all today. I have talked to a number of you about what was needed for this training this year. And so because it's really oriented to what is happening in the balance of states, I want to make sure that you have the opportunity to get questions asked. And also because there are many domestic violence experts in attendance today, that if you have anything to add to the conversation, please do so in the chat. I'm going to do my best to follow along with the chat as we go. I have it open. So we're asking or answering questions in real time, adding in the individual's commentary, that sort of thing, because God knows that will be far more interesting than listening to me. So with that being said, I'm really glad you all are here today. And I think that we have some good information to share and hopefully it will be helpful to you all. So the three major sort of areas that I've heard from you all and folks at DMA and other places have brought to my attention is that there's a lot of concern around safety planning. And so I want to talk about safety planning. I think I had a great conversation with a program yesterday where we talked a lot about building confidence in safety planning. And I think that all of you are so committed to serving survivors of domestic violence that we want to make sure that you have the confidence that you need to do that well. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the Violence Against Women Act. And for any of you that attended the DCED conference, it was last year, we had a panel or a workshop on the Violence Against Women Act. And so I want to make sure that everybody has that information. And then we're going to finish talking about eligibility. Eligibility has been tricky. And again, I really want to make sure that if folks have questions or comments to put them in the chat box so we can talk about them in real time. With the ESG CARES Act money and the continuing domestic violence money that's coming through the CoC for rapid rehousing, there's a lot of questions about eligibility. I certainly understand that the coordinated entry systems in both CoCs work differently, but the eligibility for survivors is still the same, just the path of getting there is a little different. So we want to be sure to talk about those topics today. If you have any questions, as I said, as we're going, please feel free to put them in the chat. So it's interesting to me because I think that so many of your programs are oriented to serving families. And when you have a program that serves families, the majority of the individuals or the households that you have in your program are going to be in your program either directly because of domestic violence or because they experienced domestic violence at some point in their lives. And it's challenging, I think, sometimes to make that leap, but it is true. And so the thing that I would always advise providers is that it's better to know that you have survivors in your program than not know. And so it's better to ask the questions. Your program can help with safety in lots of ways. And the first thing that I want to highlight is making sure that you are connected to your local domestic violence program. So if you are in a county where you don't know who your local DV provider is, or you're having concerns or issues communicating with them, please reach out to me. I'm always happy to build those bridges and make sure that everybody has the information they need to serve people the best. They are the experts in your community on serving survivors of domestic violence and on safety planning. So it's so important that you don't feel as though you need to do this work alone. You have partners in your community that can help you. I'm more than happy to do technical assistance work with any of you and training work with your teams if that's what's helpful to make sure that you all have the confidence to do some initial safety planning with survivors. So having policies in place with your DV agency as a partner for emergent needs is really important. It's not, some of you I think are lucky enough that you can just call the executive director or the hotline at your DV agency and you all know each other. Some of you have known each other for decades and you can have this very smooth relationship where even though both of your organizations are dealing with crisis constantly, you can still take the time to understand what is needed and how you can be helpful to each other. I think for some programs, it's not quite that easy. And again, I had a great conversation with a program yesterday where they identified some things that potentially they could do to support the DV program. So when urgent issues arise, they would be able to reach out to the DV program. And not that they couldn't do that anyway, but that sort of a burden is being taken from each. And when you sort of codify that collaboration with a policy, it really makes it easy then to have something to rely on. It's not based on the relationships with each other. It's based on the idea that your two organizations have to work together to end homelessness in your community. I think that it is also important to acknowledge that if you are serving families, you will often have an abusive partner housed with the survivor at the same time. You may not know that. That can be a really complex situation to work through. Even if the abusive partner does leave the unit, which is what we would always recommend, you still want to be able to support the abusive partner. I think sometimes in the domestic violence world, we can get into a place of really vilifying abusive partners. And I know that I couldn't do this work every day and couldn't have done it for as long as I have if I didn't inherently believe in people's ability to change. And so even though you have someone, you may even have someone in your program that is actively abusing their partner, you want to make sure that the person that's being evicted from the unit or being exited from your program because of their behavior has the resources they need. Everybody deserves housing, no matter who they are, no matter what sort of behavior they're using. And it's important to make sure that folks have the resources they need. It also is really valid to make sure that you understand what the survivor is going to need to continue to be in contact with their abusive partner. Sometimes you will house a survivor and they will seemingly have ongoing contact with their abusive partner, and you know that that's their abusive partner and you can't for the life of you understand why that's happening. So that happens for a lot of reasons. Some of them are completely based in the idea that people have relationships and it's hard to untangle from them. But others are really concrete reasons. Oftentimes an abusive partner has partial custody of the kids, or they're financially tied together. Sometimes an abusive partner is the person that providing financial aid for the family. So there are lots of reasons that they may still be in contact. So I encourage you to really listen to the survivor and identify what they need. It's important to continually have safety related conversations, to ask the questions, to not shy away from questions about what is it that you need to be safe? What have you done in the past to feel safe? And what do you need in the future to maintain the level of safety that you have or to increase it? Oftentimes we hear from people that, abusive relationships don't really happen. Both people are just in a bad relationship. And it's important to remember that bad relationships do exist. But most of the time what we see is a pattern of power and control where one person has power and authority over another to the extent that that other individual is losing their own personhood and identity. So this often can mean that relationships with family have been eliminated because the abusive partner insisted upon that, or because the family is tired of the survivor continually going back to the abusive partner. And there are many reasons and it's all challenging. So each time you work with a survivor, having highly tailored, individualized services that really address the needs of the survivor and are willing to ask the hard questions is very important. And continue to use your domestic violence agency as a referral, knowing that survivors' lives are complex. So safety planning is not a process, not a one-time event or a checklist. I remember when I first started in domestic violence work that the funder that we had wanted us to fill out this very specific form. And some of the DV programs on the call may still have this, where it was a checklist about this is what the person needs to do to be safe. And you had to fill out the checklist, you had to have the survivor sign it, and then you had to have them put it in their file. And then safety planning was done. And what we know is that there's no way that safety planning can be that uniform. When I work with survivors, oftentimes what I do is make a daily safety plan with them. If they're going out for the day and they're worried that they might see their abusive partner, or they might run into people that are affiliated with their abusive partner, it's important to know what they need, and that changes on a daily basis. So it's tailored, it's going to be different for everybody. And again, lean on your local domestic violence program and always feel free to reach out to me. So we talked a little bit about this already, but making sure that you understand, if you're housing a survivor, what the role of their abusive partner is. So if you're seeing them around, it makes sense. If you're seeing them around and you didn't expect it, then you can also have a private conversation with the survivor later to ask them what's going on. One of the things that we see over and over again is that abusive partners will often tend to sabotage the work that survivors and the progress that survivors have made. That happens all of the time in housing. Oftentimes, the minute that a survivor has signed a lease and is ready to move in and has a job and all of these things, their abusive partner will go back to court and get a custody battle going that wasn't expected, or will get folks that are affiliated with them to follow the survivor to and from their home to intimidate them, these sorts of things. So abusive partners don't typically want to see a survivor be successful because that takes away the dependence on them. And so the more success we have a survivor seeing or experiencing, the more at risk that they often are to sabotage from their partner. So keep being aware of those things and keeping that at the top of your mind is important. So we talked about some short-term safety planning, and long-term safety planning is also important too. So as we said, oftentimes when a survivor gets into permanent housing, that's when things can really start to go sideways with their abusive partner. So making sure that they know what they need to both maintain the housing and maintaining safety while in the housing. So that includes safety at home with the children. It also includes financial safety and independence, so they're not dependent on their abusive partner, or their abusive partner doesn't have access to their money. And then finally, safety on the job and in public settings. So if you're on the bus, what do you do? If you're at your job and your abusive partner shows up, what happens? Who at your job do you trust that you can talk to about what's going on so they know these sorts of things. Those are all sort of key components to long-term safety planning. So in response to the need for survivor safety, we see it both on the very individual level, which we just talked about, but we also see it on the federal level. And the biggest or the most significant legislation that has been passed to protect survivors is the Violence Against Women Act. And it is the legislation that many different interpretations of how sort of federal funding and all sorts of other things work for survivors comes from. So it was passed in '94 as a direct response to increased domestic violence. Police departments were seeing the increased DV occur and sorry, my dog is playing with a toy, and wanted to make sure that there was federal response, and it didn't just rely on states to interpret what needed to be done, or far less local municipalities. It included both funding to protect survivors of DV and individual funding and protections for survivors. So VAWA funds things, and it also protects survivors, which is two functions of a bill or a piece of legislation that can be challenging to understand. It was reauthorized twice now in 2005 and 2013. In 2013, in 2005 was the link between DV and homelessness. And in 2013, they significantly expanded. It includes coverage of sexual assault survivors on campuses and really expands who is covered under VAWA. So in 2005, the reauthorization really looked at survivors being able to live in housing without fear, which is really important. Also wanting to make sure that survivors wouldn't be denied because they are a survivor. Talked about evictions, having programs like yours and public housing authorities having the right to evict abusive partners. Lease bifurcation was part of VAWA, and allowing a survivor to establish financial independence from an abusive partner and allowing them to be eligible for programs. That was all under VAWA 2005. And these are the things, the VAWA 2005 reauthorization are the things that I feel affect our work every day as people that work to end homelessness in their communities. These are the things that keep survivors housed and stable, and we know that the main reason that families become homeless is domestic violence. And so this is integral to our work. You can't really talk about one without talking about the other. I think too that it really sort of set the stage then for individual states to decide how they wanted to interpret VAWA. We're lucky that Pennsylvania has done that in a couple ways, and we'll talk about that as we go. But one of the more exciting things is come January, we actually have some new legislation that has passed regarding how leases can be bifurcated at the state level, that state level legislation to support that. And so that will be important in giving survivors more rights to tenancy. And PCADV will be publishing and sharing some information about that in the new year. So in 2013, they maintained all current protections, and it also expanded VAWA crimes like we talked about. It expanded to protecting affiliated individuals, which is something that is important for housing providers to know. So it's anyone residing with the survivor, which makes a lot of sense. And then it also expanded across populations, which was the other really essential thing that we saw. It protects all federally subsidized housing programs. Tenants must receive a notice of rights under VAWA when they sign a lease. And it also included an emergency transfer requirement, which is something that we've been talking about in both CoCs. So the HUD issued a final rule on VAWA And that included this very sort of like high level language around the idea that survivors have the right to housing and have the right to safe housing, which is lovely. And I like sharing this with people because I think it really hits the essence of why we all do the work that we do. We want everyone to have the right to a home without the fear of violence. And that includes survivors of domestic violence. It includes anyone that we serve. And so I feel like HUD's final rule on VAWA really captured the essence of what VAWA was designed to do, and really allows providers like yourselves and advocates like all of us to be sure to have the tools to do this work, knowing that we're supported by legislation, which I think is a really big deal. So the history of the rule, this is not that interesting, but nonetheless, it's there if you'd like to read it later. And the basic housing protections and documentations for survivors, I wanted to share this with you. To be very clear about a few things. So the status as a survivor is not a reason to evict or to deny access to housing. Now, what this means is that simply because someone is surviving domestic violence and the landlord is concerned that there might be violence on the property, that is not reason to deny someone housing or to evict them from housing. All of the typical reasons that a survivor would be evicted are completely valid. So this doesn't exclude survivors from eviction. What it does is doesn't allow their status as a survivor to be the reason for denial nor eviction. So that's important. It doesn't mean that survivors can just live without reason for eviction. Applicants cannot also be denied housing based on factors that are a direct result of domestic violence. And some of us have talked about this. This is a little harder to figure out. But if a survivor has legal records, for example, or in their protection from abuse order, it is denoted in the order, which can happen, that these other things like significant credit card debt or a prior eviction were directly related to the abuse that occurred, then a survivor can also not be denied based on that. So if you're working with a survivor, you're trying to get them housed, they have an eviction on their record, but the eviction is because their abusive partner wouldn't quit damaging the property, and rather than bifurcating the lease, the landlord just evicted everybody, which happens all the time. If you can make a paper trail, it can be proved that that is in fact true, calling the old landlord, getting a letter, these sorts of things, then you can use that when you're helping a survivor find a new property to live in, and make sure that the new landlord understands VAWA and how VAWA protects survivors and why this eviction is on the individual's record. So protections can be provided based on applicant's request or with supporting documentation. I think the majority of you have seen this, but I wanted to link to the victim self-certification form. It can also be proven by a professional statement. When I was working in a DV program, we wrote a lot of letters saying that this person was involved with our organization. As DV advocates, we obviously can't disclose how they were involved, but we can, with the survivor's permission, say that they were. Also legal documentation like we talked about, or if there's other evidence. I don't want to spend too much time on the emergency transfer policy, but this was a key component of the 2013 reauthorization. Each CoC must have an emergency transfer policy, and the West and the East both do. And I think that because I do believe that the majority of you know how emergency transfer policies work with two things. The first is, if you don't, I want to encourage you to talk to the folks that are managing your coordinated entry system. I want to encourage you to talk to the consultants at DMA, and then you can also connect with me and we can make sure that you understand how it works. The ETP must make it easy for the survivor to move, not for the program to move the survivor. So the burden of the move, if their emergency transfer is needed, is on the program, not on the survivor. We are fortunate in that the emergency transfer policy, the paper policy that we have, was based on national guidance and is really well suited to serving survivors. So much so that our national partners are looking at the emergency transfer policies that both of your COCs have to try to replicate it for other balance of state COCs, which is really exciting. So in saying all of this to you, if you are needing to have assistance around an emergency transfer, please feel free to reach out to me or to DMA anytime. And if you have any questions about it, please reach out to us. It's important to know that internal transfers are different than external transfers. An internal transfer there isn't need necessarily for an ETP. With an external transfer, there would be. And it works a little differently in each COC. So again, we're happy to dig into that more if it's needed. But an emergency transfer really needs to only exist if a survivor can no longer live on the property that they currently are in. And that can happen both because they were sexually assaulted on or near the property, or the person that sexually assaulted them knows where they live. It can happen because their abusive partner knows where they live or they were assaulted on the property. It can happen because they're being stalked on the property. There are a number of reasons. So if you have a survivor that needs to move, there's always a solution, and we're happy to help you identify those solutions. So Jessica just put the East COC and the West COC policies into the chat. So if you don't have those, you can have some fantastic reading for your Friday afternoon. All of this was created to make sure that domestic violence or sexual assault survivor can continue to report the violence. That we have all worked with landlords who have evicted survivors because they were experiencing DV. And there's truly fewer worse things to do to a survivor at that point. Oftentimes, literally the only thing that's protecting a survivor is the physical presence of their home. They feel they have a place that they can be, where they can be safe, that's theirs. If that is taken away from them because their abusive partner knows where they are, that is a huge issue. And if you are ever working with landlords who need support around understanding why that's a problem, I'm always happy to talk to landlords. It's usually, landlords aren't bad people. Obviously, they make these decisions because they're business folks who need to do what's in the best best interest of their business. And oftentimes, if we can do things as programs to support landlords to keep their business running, it can be really beneficial. Rapid rehousing, increased deposits, these sorts of things are great examples of that. There's a link to the HUD documentation here that talks about what's needed for an ETP, and then we'll make sure that we send out the correct links for the ETP. Thanks for doing that, Jessica. So we're going to pivot now. Aside from safety on the individual level, how federal policy plays into safety, what VAWA means, what's sort of come out of VAWA. The other place that I hear a lot of questions is how and why are survivors eligible for CoC resources? And this is complex. Many of you have heard this, but what I have learned is that I don't think we can hear it enough, honestly. Oftentimes when I am working with someone from one of the CoCs about whether or not a survivor is eligible, what I have found is that it's never that it's being looked for a reason for a survivor to be ineligible. It's that this definition is tricky and we're all making it too hard. So what I want to try to do today is really highlight how creating eligibility under Category 4 for survivors of domestic violence is truly one of the easier ways for an individual or a family to become eligible for CoC support. So our colleagues at the National Network to End Domestic Violence have a really strong policy arm, and they were key in developing the wording and the language for the homeless definition under the HEARTH Act. And category 4 is the one that speaks directly to survivors' experience in homelessness. And it is any individual or family who is fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or other dangerous or life-threatening conditions. Persons who are fleeing or attempted to flee human trafficking also qualify as homeless under category 4. So that's the first tier, or the first requirement. The second requirement is that they have no other residence. We'll talk about that. And the third is that they lack the resources and support networks to obtain other permanent housing. So when we've all talked about this in the past, it's really important that we highlight the ands, right? And so it's not just one of these that make a survivor eligible under category 4, it's all of these. So fleeing or attempting to flee just on its own is a really complex thought process, and it's complex to identify. Dangerous or other life-threatening conditions, that idea is also really complex. Having no other residence, although that seems pretty straightforward, it's actually pretty complex. And then lacking the resources or support networks to obtain other permanent housing is something that you really have to take at face value. And so much of eligibility under category 4 is believing a survivor when they say that they are surviving domestic violence. The whole heart of homeless services is believing an individual when they say that they need something. That's a huge part of the way that we end homelessness in our communities, is believing the people that are experiencing it. So this doesn't just include survivors, it includes everyone that you serve. I'm certainly not saying that you should go blindly into situations, but assuming best intentions and giving individuals the benefit of the doubt. And when people are being you have set up a way in which the folks you are serving can be truly vulnerable with you and let you know what they need. It is our responsibility to believe them when they tell us. So the concept of fleeing looks different for every person that you will work with. It is really essential that you have a good relationship with your local domestic violence provider. If you don't, and you would like that, please reach out to me. Or if you can't get a hold of them because they are serving 1 million people a day and their hotline is constantly busy and you can never get a hold of anyone and it's endlessly frustrating, I get it. I used to work in those places and I understand that we are terrible at answering our phones a lot of the time. But what I can tell you is that you can email me anytime. PCDV's member program network knows that I respond to a lot of these questions and concerns from you all. And I do 2 things. The first is that I'm happy to talk through any situation that you're having with a survivor. I'm also happy to talk to you about how a survivor can be eligible for services and sort of help you break that down. And then I also will loop it back to your local program to make sure that they understand that they need to support the work that's occurring. And of course, as we talked about, that's a mutual beneficial relationship. So every time you're working with a survivor, the concept of fleeing for them is going to be different. And here are a few questions that you can ask. Did something make them feel unsafe in their home? Do they need to leave their current living situation in order to feel safe? Did someone do or say something to make them feel unsafe? Or did someone insist that they continue to do something to have their home? Are they worried about the safety of children, dependents, or pets? Do they feel like they're unable to return? All of these sorts of questions. You don't have to ask all of these questions. These are just a sampling. And you also don't have to ask, the entirety of each question that's listed. If there are ways that a survivor has expressed things to you about their safety in the past, pulling on that information is really important and essential. So Lee asked this question to the HUD Exchange about the definition of fleeing. And so I always want to include this in there, that this isn't just the crazy domestic violence feminist organizations that are telling you to believe survivors. It's actually HUD that's telling you to believe survivors too. So a household would meet category 4 of the definition of homelessness if they are fleeing, attempting to flee from domestic violence, and meet all of the requirements, regardless of whether they are residing, including staying with friends and family. So what this means is that if a survivor calls you and says that they need to leave and they have a lease in their name, they are still eligible for CoC funding under category 4. Now, this is where things begin to split hairs, because the requirements for CoC funding and the requirements for ESG funding are different. I often think that that was designed just to really make it challenging for all of us. Like, the folks at the federal level were like, what can we do to these poor providers? How can we really make their lives harder? I'm kidding, kind of. Anyway, this is one of the places where it's really challenging, because with ESG rapid rehousing, or ESG rapid rehousing specifically, you have to be eligible both under category 1, which is literal homelessness, and category 4, which is fleeing domestic violence. So often the folks that are in DV shelter or mainstream emergency shelter and are fleeing, those are the folks that are easiest to bring into your ESG rapid. If you have CoC rapid, a survivor can still be living in their home, comfortably financially, but the issue is if they were to leave, they would no longer have access to financial assistance. They would have no other place to go, and they need to leave due to their safety. That person would be eligible for rapid rehousing even though they have a lease in their name somewhere else. So that can be confusing, it can be complicated, and I'm always happy to think and talk through those things with folks. Dangerous and life-threatening conditions was a piece that was added not by our friends at the National Network to End Domestic Violence, but by other people who were not DV experts that were writing this policy. I always like to be really clear about that, because it is one thing that has muddied the waters for category 4. It makes it almost seem as though it's your responsibility to prove that things are dangerous or life-threatening. It is not. So the level of danger that we would see on the outside is not something that should make a survivor eligible under category 4. It should not be construed to describe the level of violence needed for a survivor to be considered homeless, and that it's absolutely up to the survivor to tell you that the situation that they're in is dangerous or life-threatening. And that can mean a whole variety of things. It doesn't mean that dangerous and life-threatening doesn't necessarily mean physical violence. What it can mean is that they get paid twice a week, and their partner takes all of their money and goes and spends it, and then they have no way to feed their children, and their partner doesn't allow them to leave their home, and so they can't feed their kids. That would be dangerous and life-threatening. So it doesn't have to be physical abuse. It can be financial abuse, like I just described. It can be emotional abuse, where an abusive partner is constantly degrading and diminishing the other individual to the point where they're looking at a mental health crisis or other things like that. And God knows we want to get them before that occurs, but oftentimes that's where emotional abuse can lead to. So dangerous and life-threatening does not mean physical violence, and it is up to the determination of the survivor. So the best way to support survivors, and this is on the PCDV website, is that you want to think about safety, you want to think about confidentiality, and you want to be trauma informed. If the survivor is interested, refer them to a local DV program. You should never require that a survivor go to a local DV program, but again, they are your community partners. Remembering the safety planning is a process, not a one-time event or checklist, and it really needs to be tailored to the survivor's life. One of the things that I often hear from programs too is that don't feel comfortable housing a survivor unless they have a protection from abuse order. And first of all, you should never have requirements like that to house folks. as your services. And getting a PFA is a pretty high barrier for many, many survivors. There are many survivors that do want to get a PFA, and that's great, but there are many survivors that it would be a much larger issue for them to do it and put them in even more danger. This could happen because an abusive partner is served with the PFA, and then that could lead to all sorts of violence. I also have had many, many legal DV advocates tell me over the course of my career that an abusive partner will walk through any piece of paper. And that is essentially what a PFA is. It's a piece of paper that says you can't come near me, when in truth, all that means is that the legal system, which most abusive folks don't have any respect for anyway, is saying that they can't do one more thing. And oftentimes the legal system has already told them they can't do many things. And so this is just adding to the list. It's not something that's going to keep a survivor safe unless the survivor is identifying that that's what they want. Now, I say all of that also knowing that oftentimes a survivor doesn't know that a PFA is an option. So talking to your local DV program to find out how to talk to survivors about getting PFAs in your area is essential. Again, you can call PCDV for that technical assistance too. Make sure that when you're working with a survivor, they know that you're not going to share their information with anyone. You know, aside from not recording emergency transfers in HMIS, no information about a survivor should be recorded in HMIS. If a survivor feels uncomfortable sharing, don't press for info. There is no required amount of information that you need to get from someone to make sure that their emergency housing need is met. Now, if the survivor moves on to rapid rehousing, we know that there are some even, minimal requirements, but it is so essential that we remember that it is not for a survivor to prove, or any person that's dealing with homelessness to prove to us that they need a resource, that we're there to make sure that we can bring as many people into that resource as possible. So making sure that we're coming at this with that mindset is really important. And then ensuring that we are trauma informed in our services. And I know that in the Balance of State, we talk a lot about what it means to be trauma informed. And all what it really boils down to is acting with kindness and compassion and vulnerability, and knowing that people really deserve the support that we can give them. So there are a couple of questions in the chat, and I would love to talk about those. And I think that if you unmute yourself, if you raise your hand, that Brendan can unmute you. Is that accurate?
We can do that.
Yes, we can unmute someone if someone wants to ask a question verbally. If you'd like to ask a question verbally, just send a chat to all panelists and we'll flag that in the next question. But we could probably just go over the questions that have come through in the chat so far, if you'd like.
Perfect. That sounds great. I want to make sure that people have the ability to ask questions based on these questions too. These are both really great questions. So Sandy asks, does the abuse have to come from a partner, or does it count as category 4 if the abuse is coming from anyone in the household? So that is a really great question, and one that we have gone around and around and around about. So if a person is feeling, let me go back to the category 4 definition, and we can walk through that. So if a person is attempting to flee domestic violence, which means that there's an intimate partner relationship, dating violence, which means there's an intimate partner relationship, sexual assault, under the idea that we can't always identify who our intimate partners are going to be, stalking, or other dangerous or life-threatening conditions. They can be eligible under category 4. So what that means is that if there is a person who they are in a relationship with in their home that's making them feel unsafe, then they can be eligible under category 4. If that person is their child, for example, we run into a problem because while that is certainly a form of violence that exists, it isn't in the spirit of category 4, but it is violence. And so if a person that is surviving that violence is in need of housing resources, what I would advise you to do is to make them eligible in any way that you can, because that person needs a safe place to live. But the true spirit of Category 4 is really looking at intimate partner violence. It has been expanded, as we talked about, over time. And so if abuse is coming from anyone in the household, I would really encourage you to talk about what it is that the person needs to move on. Oftentimes, if it is a child, there's so many other things that could occur rather than that household getting support in a myriad of different ways that could occur. If it is another adult that's living in the household but is not related, I think that, again, that's not within the spirit of Category 4. I also think that a person deserves safe housing. And so in the way that you can bring them into housing that is safe for them is important. But if a person is being violent toward another and they share a lease, oftentimes a landlord will bifurcate a lease rather than bringing an individual into the homelessness system. So the homelessness system for survivors is important because it acts as a cushion, but yet should be used as a last result. And so, or a last resource. And so if you have other resources that you can use, I would use them. This is really looking at intimate partner violence and fleeing intimate partner violence. Let's see. So Jen asks, is there a timeline on fleeing? A person who has left over a year ago from an abuser that has been living in a hotel, couch surfing, etc., for a long period of time. So again, this is an individualized situation. So if a person has left over a year ago and they have been homeless that entire time and unable to become stable, what I would tell you is that person is still fleeing because there's been no resolution. So there is no timeline on fleeing. The timeline is what has worked or not worked for the person since they left their abusive partner. So it's going to be different for each person. But again, we want to make sure that we are getting resources into the hands of people that need them the most and not looking for reasons to make people ineligible. And so Jen, in the situation that you're talking about, what I would say is that person, again, is still eligible under Category 4 because they have not found a way to be stable in the last year after leaving their abusive partner. The impacts of domestic violence can last a lifetime. And oftentimes the thing that can help heal the impacts of domestic violence is safe and stable housing. So you may work with somebody who experienced domestic violence 10 years ago, but has not been safe or stably housed since then. That person oftentimes would be eligible under Category 1 instead of Category 4, and so that makes it easier. That person also probably wouldn't need the support of the domestic violence organization in your community, but the impacts of domestic violence are still there for the individual. Also, unfortunately, it is true that oftentimes abusive partners don't go away. And so even if a person has been out of a relationship for a few years, the domestic violence can still impact their lives in a significant way, and it can begin again. I've worked with many people over the years who thought that their abusive partner had changed, and they weren't in a relationship with them, but they did have kids in common. And so they became a little more relaxed and a little more friendly and were able to do exchanges easier, would have even meals together occasionally. And it was just enough for the abusive partner to sort of get back into the situation to begin to have control again. So it can be constantly shifting. And so the more individualized services you offer, the more you can talk to a survivor about what it is they need, the better. It is often challenging to answer questions about category 4 because it really is so incredibly individualized. And that is hard when we're looking at eligibility for these very concrete programs. Let's see. Can you talk a little bit about the monitoring aspects of DV programs and confidentiality for ESG and CoC funding for regional projects not held by a DV provider? No, I don't know. Let's see. I'm not sure I understand the question.
Then maybe if you want, Jennifer, if you want to post a little bit more detail in the chat, we can respond later if possible.
That would be great. And so the next question is, what if it's a parent being violent toward an adult child? So, you know, I think that, again, family violence is something that was not captured in the intention of category 4 eligibility. If it is a parent being violent toward an adult child and that adult child needs resources, it is obviously not an intimate partner relationship. So they may be eligible for CoC funding in other ways. The majority of domestic violence programs will not serve family homelessness, folks that are experiencing family violence, but some of them will. Some of them that are on this call will. And so my expertise is in intimate partner violence. As far as making folks eligible for under category 4 regarding family violence, I think that that's something that we definitely need to dig around in as a balance of state, but it is not my expertise. And so I would encourage folks at, that maybe we should bring in folks from child welfare or other organizations like that to address that more thoroughly. I also believe that some of my friends from Transitions might be on the call, and they have a domestic violence organization that does serve family violence. And so if there are other providers at Transitions or other places across the balance of state that serve survivors of family violence that want to speak to this, I think that that would be really appropriate, because it just isn't my area of expertise. So it is always challenging to do trainings on Zoom, but I'm hoping that there is a way that if people could be unmuted, and Brendan, I'm sorry, I don't mean to ask this of you, but if folks have an experience that they would like to share, one of the ways that we really learn how to serve survivors the best is by talking about it. And so I can give you all of this information, but if we're not learning from each other, I think there's a lot that's missed. So what I'm wondering is if there are any stories that you all would like to share about survivors that you've served. What went right, what went wrong? Tara Ulrich would be happy to share about serving family violence. Thank you.
Tara, do you want me to unmute Tara?
That would be great. And then we'll go back into this. Tara, thank you.
Yeah, I was just saying, so Transitions does serve family violence. We do. We actually see quite a bit of it. Like many of the counties in the CoC, you know, our counties are very rural, so we do see a lot of generations living doubled up, and generations that then, because of other things, you know, maybe it's long-term abuse that's lasted through childhood, and the survivor just doesn't have any other options right then. So we kind of look at everything on a case-by-case basis, and, you know, will the housing resources really allow that person to kind of break those bonds of abuse that they're seeing in their family, even though it's not it's not the same animal as intimate partner violence. It is a little bit different and a little bit more, a different kind of nuance to it. What we do see is that those people who are coming to us for services, for housing, because of family violence, they don't need as long-term resources. So we really are able to help them with those lightest touch things. And maybe it is just a matter of, you know, first month's in security deposit just to get them out the door. So it kind of, in some ways, is a lot simpler than serving survivors of intimate partner violence. But there are I would say there are several in our area victim service programs who do serve family violence as well. And if anybody ever has any questions about that, I'm always happy to help or, you know, bounce ideas off of if you need that. So feel free to reach out.
Thanks, Tara.
I see a hand from Julie Kennedy. Julie, I know some people have been raising their hands on accident, so if that's the case, just let us know that.
I am a coordinated entry specialist with 211. So we are talking with many individuals on a daily basis who are not necessarily all fleeing, but there are many oftentimes that we do this. One experience that I'd like to share is the number of males who call who would fit the category of Cat 4, but are, I don't know that I would say resistant, but not acknowledging that they are fleeing or in a dangerous, life-threatening situation. So there was one individual that always stands out to me because as he was explaining his situation, and by asking him a few more questions, he did come to the realization that this was what was going on. And, you know, I completed a VI SPDAT assessment with him, got him on at that point, it was called the community queue. And he received services within 1 day. And I was really excited to see that. I actually called to follow up with him on that, you know, several days prior, after that, sorry. And he was just very impressed with how everything went. So I do think that sometimes we are met with individuals who don't acknowledge it, don't know what domestic violence even looks like, because it's not, as Maria has said, it's not physical, but there are elements that they just don't, you know, the knowledge base isn't there. And I've been happy to be able to discuss what domestic violence looks like and means with so many people who, you know, they have kind of that come to Jesus moment on the phone with me where they're like, wow, that really, you know, this is something that I should be looking at or seeing. And, you know, I'm so happy that I can be there with someone when they come to that point and then assist them further with those resources.
That is really fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. I think that really speaks to the power that you all have in the community. That, you know, we often say in the domestic violence community that we are people's last stop. They have tried every option in the world that they can think of before they're going to call a domestic violence hotline. Oftentimes, because of what you just said, they don't even truly, they wouldn't even identify what they're experiencing as domestic violence. So to be able to have somebody say to them, you know, what I'm hearing is that you're experiencing this and this is how this feels. And this is what I've heard from other people when they've said similar things to me before. And that sort of thing, I think can be incredibly powerful. So thank you for your great work. I also want to highlight something else you said, which is that domestic violence can happen to people of any gender. So we are all across the state, equipped to serve men and trans people who are survivors of domestic violence. All of our member programs are not equipped in the same way. Some folks have more resources to do that than others, but it should never be the case that an individual is denied domestic violence emergency shelter because of their gender or gender expression. VAWA is crystal clear about serving men and trans individuals, and that is part of our work, and our other federal funders are crystal clear about that also. It is also real that there are far more women that experience domestic violence than men, and that men are often the very last people to report that they have experienced domestic violence. So it's terribly underreported by men, it's terribly underreported by queer people. And so the more that we can hold space for folks that are, identify in different ways than female to talk about the domestic violence they've experienced and really receive the support that they need for that, the better. So, Julie, thank you.
I think Kayla Gower had your hand up. Kayla, do you want to share?
Hi, everybody. So I just wanted to jump in kind of a little bit with the family violence that I know Tara already talked about. And I've been out of the game for a little bit, but prior to coming into the role that I'm doing now, I was doing housing advocacy at Transitions. And I know that Maria and I, as well as other victim service providers across the Eastern CoC, have talked about this. Sometimes you're serving people that seem unlikely, or it seems like, you're maybe not looking at them as the typical victim or who you would think you'd be serving under category 4. I think about specifically a household that we worked with, a survivor that we worked with, who initially presented more so with children and youth involvement. And I know Maria kind of touched on that, but it could also be that there is that generational family abuse and potentially sexual abuse going on with one of the children in the household. And I feel like that in combination, maybe people are not seeing that as also having that dual component of intimate partner violence, although if it's a paramour that is sexually abusing one of the kids in the household, there is coercion and control happening there. I don't know that the survivor that we worked with would have necessarily, identified being a victim of domestic violence, but she was in like a very serious situation where she was a victim and also her child was victimized in the situation. So, I would just keep in mind that sometimes you're serving people that maybe seem unlikely, but often those are the people that are, the most in need. And we've talked about that a lot with our victim service providers.
Thanks, Kayla, I appreciate that. So I'm trying to backtrack a little bit. We got, trying to see what we missed. So regarding ESG, Brendan put in the chat that there's a document that DCED published that outlined how to monitor programs. So if you are monitoring a DV program, DV programs are not required to share any personally identifying information with you as the grantee. So they are protected by confidentiality. So if you've never monitored a DV program before, you're going to sit with someone with a bunch of paper files with a bunch of black marks on the paper files. It's very exciting. And you want to look for the content that is required for whatever funding source it is that you have, but know that you're not going to receive any identifying information, nor are you going to be allowed to look in the comparable database that we use or anything like that. All information is shared redacted, and that is due to the confidentiality of the survivor. I do not, PCADV does not have ESG funding as pass-through, and so I have never monitored for ESG, but I can tell you with HUD funding and as a person who was formerly a provider who did receive ESG funds, that's how the monitoring looks. It's just so important that the information is redacted. So I'm trying to see if I missed any.
I think you got everything. I don't see any questions that were not addressed by you. So, and I don't see any other hands raised right now.
Okay. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I'm happy to hear from other folks about what has gone well in your organizations or what you're struggling with. But here is my contact information, and you are welcome to reach out to me anytime. I'm happy to provide you assistance with, everything from how the coordinated entry system is working in your area to what is needed to better serve survivors in housing. I do want to let you know that there is a significant increase in domestic violence rapid rehousing funding across the balance of state, which is very exciting. So your DV providers in your area, if you have not developed strong partnerships with them yet, they will be reaching out to you to do so because they are really becoming a part of the homelessness response system in your area in an even more solid way. So as things are developing with those relationships, please reach out to me if there is anything that's needed or if you need any technical assistance around how to best serve survivors. And that is all I had.
Thank you, Maria. We will send a follow-up email to folks. It may take us a couple of days to get everything together, but we'll share the recording from today's webinar. We can share out some of the resources we posted in the chat, like the emergency transfer policies, and Brendan noted an ESG document that may be pertinent to some folks. So we will share that after the training. And if folks have questions, Maria shared her email address. So feel free to reach out to Maria or to the CoC email. I also put a link in the chat to reminder to log your attendance. There's a link for the CoC East attendance form and the West. Thank you so much, Maria. I always learn a lot when I hear you speak. So thank you for sharing. And I hope that others found it beneficial as well.
Thanks so much.